For 10 years, the most ruthless king in the north set a golden plate for a ghost. The roasted meat always grew cold. The wine sat untouched. Silas ruled with iron and blood. But his court sat in paralyzed terror, forced to watch a tyrant mourn an empty chair. Tonight was the 10th anniversary of her funeral. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors blew open. A shivering beggar stepped out of the freezing storm. Silas stood, his dark eyes promising death to the intruder. But the woman pulled back her icy hood. She revealed the exact hazel eyes he had buried a decade ago. A fragile voice shattered the absolute silence. "You need to stop setting that plate for me, Silas. The food is always cold." The silver spoon clattered against the heavy oak table. Silas did not look up. He kept his eyes fixed on the map spread beneath his goblet. A young servant backed away from the empty chair with trembling hands. Steam rose from the fresh roasted pheasant on the untouched golden plate. 10 years had passed since Olivia last sat in that seat. The plate was always warm. The wine was always poured. Silas demanded it. He ruled the northern territories with an iron grip that left his enemies in ashes. Men called him a tyrant behind closed doors. They whispered about the king, who won every war but lost his mind to grief. Tonight marked exactly 1 decade since the winter fever took her. The great hall was completely silent. Dozens of lords and ladies ate their meals in muted fear. No one dared to let their cutlery scrape too loudly. No one dared to look at the empty chair at the king's right hand. Silas finally pushed his map aside. He picked up his goblet and took a slow drink. The wine tasted like ash. Everything had tasted like ash since the morning the healers pulled the sheet over Olivia's face. He set the cup down. His gaze drifted to the cushion of her chair. He remembered the way she used to lean across the armrest to whisper in his ear. He remembered the weight of her hand on his wrist when his temper flared. Now there was only polished wood and cold metal. Wind howled against the stone walls of the keep. A brutal blizzard had trapped the court inside for 3 days. The fires in the hearth struggled against the draft. Silas felt the chill in his bones. He preferred the cold. It matched the hollow space sitting heavy in his chest. Lord Thorn cleared his throat from the far end of the table. The older man stood up slowly. "My king," Thorn began. Silas shifted his dark eyes to the advisor. "The storm has buried the southern roads," Thorn said. "Send men to clear them at dawn," Silas replied. His voice was a low rasp that carried through the quiet room. "We lack the manpower, sire." Thorn hesitated. Silas gripped the edge of the table. His knuckles turned white under the candlelight. "Then find more men." Thorn swallowed hard and bowed his head. "As you command." The brief exchange drained the remaining warmth from the room. Silas hated the fear in their eyes, but he used it. Fear kept the borders safe. Fear kept the lords paying their taxes. Love had failed him entirely. He looked back at Olivia's plate. The meat had grown cold. The gravy was congealing around the edges of the gold rim. This was the hardest part of the day. Every evening, he forced himself to watch her dinner go untouched. It was his punishment for failing to save her. He had conquered 3 neighboring kingdoms to secure medicine for her lungs. He had brought the finest physicians in the world to her bedside. None of it mattered. Death did not care about crowns. A heavy wooden clock chimed in the corner of the hall. It was time to end the meal. Silas gave a curt nod to the head steward. The servants stepped forward in unison to clear the tables. A boy approached Olivia's plate setting. He reached out to take the golden plate. Silas raised his hand. The boy froze instantly. "Leave it," Silas commanded. The steward rushed forward and pulled the boy back. "But sire, the meal is over," the steward whispered. Silas stood up. His tall frame cast a long shadow across the high table. "I said leave it." The hall held its collective breath. Usually, Silas allowed her plate to be cleared with his own. Tonight was different. The grief sat heavier in his throat tonight. He stepped down from the dais. The lords and ladies stood up immediately out of respect. Silas ignored them. He walked down the center aisle of the hall. His boots echoed against the stone floor. He needed to be alone in the dark. He reached the heavy oak doors at the end of the room. 2 guards pulled the doors open for him. A sharp gust of freezing wind blew into the corridor. The main entrance to the keep was rattling violently. Someone was pounding on the heavy iron gates outside. Silas stopped walking. No travelers survived blizzards like this. No patrols were scheduled to return until the weather broke. The pounding echoed again, desperate and rhythmic. A captain of the guard jarred toward Silas. "My king, someone is at the gates," the captain said. "I can hear that," Silas replied. "They are demanding entry, sire." Silas frowned. "Who travels in this storm?" "A woman, sire." Silas felt a strange prickle on the back of his neck. "Turn her away," Silas said. "We have no room for beggars." The captain did not move. "She is not begging, sire." Silas narrowed his eyes. "Explain yourself." The captain looked deeply uncomfortable. "She demands to see the king." "Many fools demand things," Silas said sharply. He turned to walk up the stairs to his chambers. "She carries a signet ring, sire," the captain blurted out. Silas froze on the bottom step. He slowly turned his head. "What kind of ring?" "Silver, sire." The captain lowered his voice. "With the crest of the royal house." Silas felt his pulse hammer in his ears. There were only 2 silver signet rings in existence. One was currently on his right hand. The other was buried 10 feet deep in the royal crypt. Silas marched past the captain. He headed straight for the courtyard doors. The cold did not matter anymore. He shoved past the guards stationed at the entryway. He threw the heavy wooden bars off the side door himself. The storm hit him like a physical blow. Snow blinded him for a moment. He squinted into the darkness. A figure stood shivering in the snowdrifts beneath the torches. She wore a heavy wool cloak covered in ice. Her face was hidden beneath a deep hood. Silas stepped out into the freezing wind. "Who are you?" he shouted over the storm. The woman reached up with a trembling, gloved hand. She pulled back the hood. Silas stopped breathing. The wind tore at her dark hair. Her skin was pale and drawn from the cold. Her eyes were exactly the same shade of hazel that had haunted his dreams for a decade. It was impossible. It was a trick of the light or a hallucination born of his grief. The woman looked up at the towering king. She did not bow. She did not flinch from his terrifying stare. She stepped closer to him. "Silas," she said. Her voice was hoarse and broken. It was the voice he had buried 10 years ago. "You need to stop setting that plate for me," Olivia said. "The food is always cold." The wind screamed through the open courtyard. Silas stared at the woman standing in the snow. His lungs forgot how to pull in air. Snowflakes gathered on his dark eyelashes. He could not look away from her hazel eyes. This was a cruel trick played by a fractured mind. He had spent 10 years burying his heart alongside her coffin. Dead women did not walk through winter storms. Dead women did not complain about cold dinners. Olivia swayed on her foot. Her knees finally buckled under the weight of the frozen wool. She collapsed toward the icy cobblestones. Silas lunged forward instinctively. His boots cracked the ice beneath him. He caught her before her knees hit the ground. Her body felt impossibly light in his arms. The freezing dampness of her cloak seeped into his tunic. She was shivering violently against his chest. He pulled her against him to block the biting wind. Her cold cheek rested against his jaw. She smelled of pine needles and damp earth. It was not the scent of a ghost. Ghosts did not shiver. Ghosts did not bleed. He noticed a raw scrape on her jawline where the cold had cracked her skin. A fierce, protective instinct roared to life in his chest. It was a feeling he had forced into submission a decade ago. He scooped her up effortlessly. She weighed no more than a bundle of dry kindling. Silas turned his back to the storm. He kicked the heavy courtyard door shut behind them. The sudden silence in the corridor rang in his ears. "Open the great hall," Silas barked at the guards. The two soldiers scrambled to obey. They hauled the heavy oak doors open. Silas strode into the cavernous room carrying his frozen burden. The lords and ladies had not yet dispersed. They froze in their places. Dozens of eyes locked onto their king. They saw Silas clutching a ragged woman to his chest. Gasps rippled through the gathered nobility. Lord Thorne stepped down from the dais. "Sire, what is the meaning of this?" Thorne asked. Silas ignored the advisor. He carried Olivia straight toward the high table. He bypassed his own heavy wooden throne. He walked directly to the empty chair on the right. He gently placed her onto the velvet cushion. Olivia slumped against the armrest. Her breathing was shallow and uneven. Silas stripped off his heavy fur mantle. He wrapped the thick pelt tightly around her trembling shoulders. The dark fur dwarfed her small frame. She looked fragile sitting in the oversized chair. "Bring blankets," Silas ordered. No one moved. The servants were paralyzed by the bizarre scene. Silas turned his head slowly. His eyes promised immediate violence. "Fetch blankets, hot water, and the physician," he roared. "Do it now, or I will hang every man in this room." The great hall erupted into frantic movement. Servants sprinted toward the kitchen and the upper floors. Lords backed away into the shadows. Thorne moved closer with a deeply furrowed brow. "My king, who is this beggar?" Thorne whispered. Silas grabbed Thorne by the collar of his silk tunic. He lifted the older man off his feet. "Choose your next words carefully," Silas warned. His voice was a deadly whisper. "You are speaking about your queen." Thorne choked on his own breath. Silas dropped him to the stone floor. The king turned his attention back to the chair. Olivia was struggling to pry off her stiff leather gloves. Her fingers were glue and clumsy. Silas knelt on the cold floor beside her. He batted her weak hands away gently. He took hold of her left glove. He pulled the wet leather loose. Her bare hand was freezing to the touch. Silas pressed her palm flat against his own broad hand. Her fingers barely reached his knuckles. He traced the center of her palm with his thumb. A jagged white scar cut across her lifeline. She had burned herself on a hot iron during their first year of marriage. He remembered the smell of the ointment. He remembered wrapping the linen bandages himself. Silas closed his eyes. A shudder ran through his massive shoulders. He pressed her icy knuckles against his lips. "You are real," he whispered into her skin. Olivia let out a ragged sigh. "I am cold, Silas," she murmured. "You are always so warm." He opened his eyes and looked at her face. The firelight danced across her pale features. 10 years had changed almost nothing. There were faint lines around her eyes that had not been there before. Her cheekbones were sharper from hunger. But it was her. The physician rushed into the hall carrying a leather satchel. 2 maids followed closely behind with armfuls of thick quilts. "Step aside, sire," the physician said nervously. Silas did not move. He kept his grip on Olivia's hand. "Examine her here," Silas commanded. The physician knelt quickly and opened his bag. The maids draped the quilts over the fur mantle. Olivia was buried under layers of heavy fabric. Only her face remained visible. She turned her head slightly. Her gaze fell upon the untouched dinner plate sitting on the table beside her. The roasted pheasant was congealed in cold fat. The silver goblet held stagnant wine. "I told you," Olivia said softly. Her voice barely carried over the crackling hearth. "The food is always cold." Silas reached up and touched her cheek. "I kept your place ready," he said. "Every night." "For 10 years," she replied. Her hazel eyes locked upon his dark stare. "That is a very long time to hold a funeral, Silas." "I never buried you in my heart," he answered. The physician pressed 2 fingers against her throat to check her pulse. "Her heartbeat is sluggish, sire," the physician reported. "She requires warmth and broth immediately." "Prepare my chambers," Silas told the maids. "Build the fire until the room feels like a furnace." The maids bowed and hurried away. Silas stood up and reached down to gather her into his arms again. He lifted her along with all the blankets. Thorns stepped into their path. The advisor looked terrified but resolute. "Silas, this is madness," Thorn pleaded. "We all saw the queen die." Silas paused. He looked down at the man who had served him for over a decade. "You saw a sickness take her," Silas said evenly. "We sealed her in the crypt. And yet, she sits in my arms." Thorn shook his head. "This could be magic, or a spy sent by the Western rebels." Silas tightened his grip on Olivia. "If she is a spy, she has already conquered the king." Silas walked past the trembling advisor. He carried her out of the great hall and toward the main staircase. The stone steps were steep and winding. He took them 2 at a time without breaking a sweat. He reached the heavy oak door of his private quarters. A guard pushed it open for him. A wave of intense heat washed over them. The maids had stoked the massive fireplace with dry logs. Flames roared up the stone chimney. Silas walked to the center of the room. He laid her down on the massive feather bed. The red velvet canopy cast a warm shadow over her face. He sat on the edge of the mattress. He began to unfasten the wet clasp of her cloak. "I can do it," Olivia whispered. She tried to push his hands away. Her fingers lacked the strength to move him. "Rest," Silas ordered softly. He pulled the ruined wool away from her body. Underneath the cloak, she wore simple peasant clothes. The rough spun tunic was patched in several places. She wore no jewelry. Her silk gowns and velvet dresses were rotting in a stone tomb below the castle. He pulled the thick quilts up to her chin. He poured a cup of warm water from an iron kettle by the fire. He slid his arms behind her shoulders. He lifted her up so she could drink. She swallowed eagerly. Some of the water spilled down her chin. He wiped it away with his thumb. She leaned back against the pillows with a long exhale. Color was slowly returning to her lips. The frostbite on her cheeks looked angry and red. Silas set the cup on the bedside table. He did not pull his arm out from behind her. He leaned close enough to feel her breath against his collarbone. "Where have you been, Olivia?" He kept his voice steady. He did not want to frighten her. He needed to understand the impossibility lying in his bed. Olivia closed her eyes. "It is dark down there, Silas." Her words sent a sharp spike of ice through his veins. "Down where?" he asked. She opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling. "In the box?" Silas went completely still. "You buried me wearing my emerald necklace," she said. "The clasp always pinched the back of my neck." She reached a hand out from under the blankets. She rubbed the nape of her neck absent-mindedly. Silas felt a terrifying nausea twist his stomach. Only he and the silent monks knew what she was buried in. He had placed the necklace on her himself before closing the lid. "How did you get out?" Silas asked. His voice cracked for the first time in 10 years. "I scratched at the wood until my fingers bled," she answered plainly. She held up both of her hands in the firelight. Silas stared at her fingernails. They were scarred and crooked. 10 years ago they had been perfectly manicured and soft. Now, they looked like they had dug through solid oak and stone. "A grave robber broke the seal on the crypt," Olivia continued. Her tone was strangely detached. She sounded like she was recounting a story about a stranger. "He wanted the emeralds. He opened the lid. I opened my eyes." Silas grabbed her hands and pressed them to his chest. He could feel her pulse racing against his own heartbeat. "He screamed," she said softly. "He dropped his crowbar and ran. I climbed out." Silas closed his eyes tightly. The image of her trapped in the dark for days sickened him. "That was 10 years ago," Silas said. "Why did you not come back to me?" Olivia turned her head to look at him. Her eyes were hollow and full of exhaustion. "Because my lungs were still rotten, Silas. I could barely walk past the graveyard gates. I collapsed in the mud near the lower village. A salt merchant found me on the road." She pulled her hands free from his grip. She tucked them safely back under the warm quilts. "He threw me in the back of his wagon and took me south, far across the mountains." Silas felt a dangerous, familiar rage building in his chest. "I will slaughter him," Silas promised. "I will burn his entire village to ash." Olivia shook her head against the pillows. "He is already dead." She closed her eyes again. "I had to heal first, Silas. I had to find a way to breathe without coughing up blood. It took years just to stand upright." Silas touched her hair. "You are home now. I will post 100 guards at this door. No one will ever take you away again." Olivia did not answer immediately. The crackle of the fireplace filled the silence. She opened her eyes and looked deeply into his. "There are men hunting me, Silas." The king felt a grim smile peg the corner of his mouth. His eyes turned black with absolute violence. "Let them come," he whispered. The fire snapped loudly in the stone hearth. Silas kept his eyes locked on her face. He waited for her to speak. Olivia pulled the heavy quilt higher around her neck. "The salt merchant did not save me out of kindness," she began. "He realized my hands were too soft for a peasant. He thought a wealthy family might pay a ransom for my return." Silas felt his jaw clenched tight enough to crack his teeth. "But you had no memory to give him," Silas said. Olivia nodded slowly. "The fever had burned away most of my past. I could not tell him my name. I could not tell him about this castle or the northern snow. When the merchant realized I was useless, he sold me." Silas stood up from the edge of the bed. He needed to move before his anger shattered the furniture. He paced toward the roaring fire. "Who bought you?" Silas asked. His back was turned to her. He did not want her to see the murder in his eyes. "Lord Malachor of the Southern Iron Mines," Olivia answered. The name echoed in the quiet room. Silas knew the man well. Malachor was a brutal warlord who supplied steel for the Western armies. "He bought me to wash clothes and haul water," she said. "The labor nearly killed me during the first winter. My lungs were still weak from the rot, but the hard work eventually forced my body to rebuild itself." Silas turned back to face the bed. He imagined his delicate wife hauling heavy buckets through freezing mud. The thought made his blood run cold. "I will mount Malachor's head on a spike," Silas vowed. "I will burn his mines until the iron melts into glass." Olivia offered a sad, exhausted smile. "He does not know who I am, Silas. I was just a nameless servant to him. I kept my head down. I scrubbed floors and stayed out of sight. My memories started returning 3 years ago." Silas walked back to the bed and sat down again. "Why did you wait so long to come home?" he asked. The question carried a trace of pain he could not hide. "I had nothing to offer you," Olivia whispered. "I looked in the mirror and saw a broken, scarred woman. I thought you would have taken a new queen by now." Silas grabbed her hand under the quilt. He squeezed her fingers firmly. "There is no other queen," he said. "There will never be another queen." Olivia let out a shaky breath. "I decided to stay in the South and live a quiet life. I thought you were better off remembering me as I was. But then things changed last month." Silas leaned forward. "What changed?" Olivia looked away toward the flickering shadows on the wall. Malachor brought a new group of prisoners to the compound. Most of them were political enemies. One of them was a boy. Silas stayed completely silent. "He is 8 years old," Olivia continued. "He was born deaf. His parents died in the western border skirmishes. Malachor planned to send him into the narrowest mine shafts." Olivia turned her gaze back to Silas. Her hazel eyes burned with a sudden, fierce defiance. The boy would not have survived a week in the dark. The overseers left him in the freezing rain when he did not hear their work bells. I found him shivering behind the barracks one night. He was starving and alone. Silas watched the firelight dance in his wife's eyes. He recognized that specific look of stubborn determination. It was the same look she wore when she challenged his battle plans a decade ago. "You tried to save him," Silas said. "I did save him," Olivia corrected. "I stole a kitchen knife and cut his bindings. I packed a single bag of stolen rations. We ran into the woods before the dawn bell rang." Silas realized the gravity of her actions. Stealing property from a southern warlord was a death sentence. "Malachor sent his hunters after you," Silas stated. "Yes," Olivia said. They have dogs and horses. We stayed in the rivers to hide our scent. We walked north for 4 weeks. I knew this was the only place in the world where Malicor's men could not reach us. Silas felt a strange warmth spread through his chest. She had fled to him for protection. Even after 10 years, she knew he was her safest harbor. "Where's the boy now?" Silas asked. Olivia gripped his hand tightly. Panic flared in her eyes for the first time. "He is hiding in the hollow oak tree near the old crossroads. I told him to wait there while I checked the gates. I did not know if the guards would shoot me on sight." Silas stood up instantly. The crossroads were 2 miles down the mountain path. The blizzard was still raging outside the castle windows. "He has my thickest wool blanket," Olivia pleaded. "But he cannot survive the night in this storm." Silas reached for his heavy fur mantle. "He will not have to," Silas said. He threw the thick pelt over his broad shoulders. He fastened the iron clasp at his throat. "Rest here, Olivia. The maids will bring you hot broth and bread." Olivia pushed herself up on her elbows. "You must find him, Silas. His name is Elian. He cannot hear you call for him. You must look for the broken branch marking the hollow." Silas walked to the door. He paused and looked back at his wife. "I will find him, Silas. His name is Elian. He cannot hear you call for him. You must look for the broken branch marking the hollow." Silas walked to the door. He paused and looked back at his wife. "I will find him, I swear it on my life." Silas opened the heavy oak door and strode into the hallway. He shouted for the captain of the guard. The armored man ran up the stairs a moment later. "Sire, the blizzard is worsening," the captain warned. "Saddle my horse," Silas ordered. "But sire, the snow is waist deep." Silas grabbed the captain by his iron breastplate. "Saddle my horse, or I will ride you down the mountain." The captain nodded frantically and hurried away. Silas walked down to the armory. He bypassed the heavy broadswords and lances. He picked up a simple iron lantern and a thick woolen blanket. He walked out into the biting wind of the courtyard. A stable boy was holding the reins of a massive black stallion. The horse snorted and stomped its hooves as the ice. Silas swung himself into the leather saddle. He lit the lantern with a flint strike. He kicked the horse into a gallop before the gates were fully open. The storm swallowed him immediately. Snow whipped against his face like shattered glass. The wind roared through the pines with deafening force. Silas leaned low over the horse's neck. He trusted the beast to find the path hidden under the drifts. He held the lantern high to pierce the gloom. The cold numbed his fingers within minutes. He did not care about the pain. His mind was entirely focused on the task. Olivia had risked everything to save this child. He would not let her sacrifice end in tragedy. The horse pushed through the snowdrifts with immense power. They reached the bottom of the mountain slope. The old crossroads appeared faintly through the whiteout. 4 ancient stone markers stood buried in the snow. Silas pulled back on the reins. The horse slowed to a cautious walk. Silas scanned the tree line for the massive oak. The trees all looked identical in the dark. He urged the horse forward along the edge of the woods. He searched for the broken branch Olivia had mentioned. The wind threatened to blow out his lantern. He shielded the glass with his gloved hand. Then he saw it. A massive trunk loomed out of the darkness. A thick branch hung low and splintered near the base. Silas dismounted quickly. He tied the reins to a sturdy sapling. He waded through the deep snow toward the oak. The trunk had a wide split near the roots. It formed a natural, shallow cave. Silas held the lantern up to the opening. He peered inside the dark hollow. A small bundle of gray wool sat wedged in the farthest corner. Silas crawled into the narrow space. The wind was instantly muffled by the thick wood. He reached out and touched the blanket. The bundle flinched violently. A pale face emerged from the folds of the wool. The boy had wide, terrified blue eyes. He held a heavy stick defensively in front of his chest. Silas did not speak. Olivia had said the boy was deaf. Words would only frighten him more. Silas slowly lowered the lantern. He unfastened his heavy fur mantle. He held the thick pelt open to show his empty hands. The boy pressed himself harder against the bark. He was shivering uncontrollably. His lips were stained glue from the freezing air. Silas moved slowly and deliberately. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of hard bread. He held the bread out on his open palm. The boy stared at the food. Hunger warred with fear in his small face. Silas kept his hand perfectly still. He waited patiently. He had spent years hunting wild beasts in these woods. He knew how to earn trust through stillness. The boy slowly lowered the stick. He reached out a trembling hand and snatched the bread. He began to eat with frantic bites. Silas smiled softly. He pointed to the boy. Then he pointed back out toward the direction of the castle. He made a cradling motion with his arms to mimic holding Olivia. The boy stopped chewing. Recognition flashed in his eyes. He knew Silas came from the woman who saved him. Silas held out his hand. The boy hesitated for a long moment. He looked at the dark storm raging outside the tree. Then he looked at the massive man offering him shelter. The boy dropped the stick and took Silas's hand. Silas pulled the child forward gently. He wrapped his huge fur mantle around the boy's thin shoulders. He lifted the child against his chest. The boy buried his face in the warm fur. Silas backed out of the hollow tree. The storm hit them again immediately. Silas shielded the boy's body with his own bulk. He carried the child to the waiting horse. He climbed into the saddle and situated the boy in front of him. He tucked the boy securely inside the heavy folds of his riding coat. Silas turned the horse back toward the mountain. The ride back was grueling and slow. The snow continued to pile up on the treacherous path. Silas felt the boy's shivering gradually subside against his stomach. The child had fallen asleep from pure exhaustion. The castle gates appeared through the blizzard like a towering shadow. The guards hauled the heavy iron doors open. Silas rode straight into the sheltered courtyard. Stable hands rushed forward to take the exhausted horse. Silas dismounted while holding the sleeping boy carefully. He ignored the murmurs of the gathered soldiers. He walked briskly into the warm corridors of the keep. He did not stop until he reached his prized chambers. He kicked the heavy door open. Olivia was sitting up in bed holding a wooden bowl. She dropped the bowl onto the mattress when she saw him. Silas walked to the fire and set the boy down on a thick rug. The child looked up and blinked at the bright light. He looked around the massive room in confusion. Then he saw Olivia. The boy scrambled to his feet. He ran across the room and threw his arms around her neck. Olivia buried her face in the boy's dirty hair. Tears streamed down her scarred cheeks. She rocked him back and forth against her chest. Silas stood by the fire and watched them. He felt a strange tightening in his throat. He had ruled a kingdom for a decade with absolute authority. He had won wars and executed traitors without blinking. But watching this broken woman hold this rescued child humbled him. Olivia looked up at Silas through her tears. She did not need to speak. Her eyes held a profound gratitude that words could not capture. Silas walked over to the bed. He sat down on the edge of the mattress beside them. He placed his large hand on the back of the boy's head. The child flinched slightly but did not pull away. "He's safe now," Silas promised softly. "No one will ever hurt either of you again." The fire snapped loudly in the stone hearth. Silas kept his eyes locked at her face. He waited for her to speak. Olivia pulled the heavy quilt higher around her neck. "The salt merchant did not save me out of kindness," she began. "He realized my hands were too soft for a peasant. He thought a wealthy family might pay a ransom for my return." Silas felt his jaw clench tight enough to crack his teeth. "But you had no memory to give him," Silas said. Olivia nodded slowly. "The fever had burned away most of my past. I could not tell him my name. I could not tell him about this castle or the northern snow. When the merchant realized I was useless, he sold me." Silas stood up from the edge of the bed. He needed to move before his anger shattered the furniture. He paced toward the roaring fire. "Who bought you?" Silas asked. His back was turned to her. He did not want her to see the murder in his eyes. "Lord Malachor of the Southern Iron Mines," Olivia answered. The name echoed in the quiet room. Silas knew the man well. Malachor was a brutal warlord who supplied steel for the Western armies. "He bought me to wash clothes and haul water," she said. "The labor nearly killed me during the first winter. My lungs were still weak from the rot, but the hard work eventually forced my body to rebuild itself." Silas turned back to face the bed. He imagined his delicate wife hauling heavy buckets through freezing mud. The thought made his blood run cold. "I will mount Malachor's head on a spike," Silas vowed. "I will burn his mines until the iron melts into glass." Olivia offered a sad, exhausted smile. "He does not know who I am, Silas. I was just a nameless servant to him. I kept my head down. I scrubbed the floors and stayed out of sight. My memories started returning 3 years ago." Silas walked back to the bed and sat down again. "Why did you wait so long to come home?" he asked. The question carried a trace of pain he could not hide. "I had nothing to offer you," Olivia whispered. "I looked in the mirror and saw a broken, scarred woman. I thought you would have taken a new queen by now." Silas grabbed her hand under the quilt. He squeezed her fingers firmly. "There is no other queen," he said. "There will never be another queen." Olivia let out a shaky breath. "I decided to stay in the South and live a quiet life. I thought you were better off remembering me as I was. But then things changed last month." Silas leaned forward. "What changed?" Olivia looked away toward the flickering shadows on the wall. Malachor brought a new group of prisoners to the compound. Most of them were political enemies. One of them was a boy. Silas stayed completely silent. "He is 8 years old," Olivia continued. "He was born deaf. His parents died in the western border skirmishes. Malachor planned to send him into the narrowest mine shafts." Olivia turned her gaze back to Silas. Her hazel eyes burned with a sudden, fierce defiance. The boy would not have survived a week in the dark. The overseers left him in the freezing rain when he did not hear their work bells. I found him shivering behind the barracks one night. He was starving and alone. Silas watched the firelight dance in his wife's eyes. He recognized that specific look of stubborn determination. It was the same look she wore when she challenged his battle plans a decade ago. "You tried to save him," Silas said. "I did save him," Olivia corrected. "I stole a kitchen knife and cut his bindings. I packed a single bag of stolen rations. We ran into the woods before the dawn bell rang." Silas realized the gravity of her actions. Stealing property from a southern warlord was a death sentence. "Malachor sent his hunters after you," Silas stated. "Yes," Olivia said. "They have dogs and horses. We stayed in the rivers to hide our scent. We walked north for 4 weeks. I knew this was the only place in the world where Malachor's men could not reach us." Silas felt a strange warmth spread through his chest. She had fled to him for protection. Even after 10 years, she knew he was her safest harbor. "Where is the boy now?" Silas asked. Olivia gripped his hand tightly. Panic flared in her eyes for the first time. "He is hiding in the Hyo oak tree near the old crossroads. I told him to wait there while I checked the gates. I did not know if the guards would shoot me on sight." Silas stood up instantly. The crossroads were 2 miles down the mountain path. The blizzard was still raging outside the castle windows. "He has my thickest wool blanket," Olivia pleaded. "But he cannot survive the night in this storm." Silas reached for his heavy fur mantle. "He will not have to," Silas said. He threw the thick pelt over his broad shoulders. He fastened the iron clasp at his throat. "Rest here, Olivia. The maids will bring you hot broth and bread." Olivia pushed herself up on her elbows. "You must find him, Silas. His name is Elian. He cannot hear you call for him. You must look for the broken branch marking the hollow." Silas walked to the door. He paused and looked back at his wife. "I will find him. I swear it on my life." Silas opened the heavy oak door and strode into the hallway. He shouted for the captain of the guard. The armored man ran up the stairs a moment later. "Sire, the blizzard is worsening," the captain warned. "Saddle my horse," Silas ordered. "But sire, the snow is waist deep." Silas grabbed the captain by his iron breastplate. "Saddle my horse, or I will ride you down the mountain." The captain nodded frantically and hurried away. Silas walked down to the armory. He bypassed the heavy broadswords and lances. He picked up a simple iron lantern and a thick woolen blanket. He walked out into the biting wind of the courtyard. A stable boy was holding the reins of a massive black stallion. The horse snorted and stomped its hooves against the ice. Silas swung himself into the leather saddle. He lit the lantern with a flint strike. He kicked the horse into a gallop before the gates were fully open. The storm swallowed him immediately. Snow whipped against his face like shattered glass. The wind roared through the pines with deafening force. Silas leaned low over the horse's neck. He trusted the beast to find the path hidden under the drifts. He held the lantern high to pierce the gloom. The cold numbed his fingers within minutes. He did not care about the pain. His mind was entirely focused on the task. Olivia had risked everything to save this child. He would not let her sacrifice end in tragedy. The horse pushed through the snowdrifts with immense power. They reached the bottom of the mountain slope. The old crossroads appeared faintly through the whiteout. 4 ancient stone markers stood buried in the snow. Silas pulled back on the reins. The horse slowed to a cautious walk. Silas scanned the tree line for the massive oak. The trees all looked identical in the dark. He urged the horse forward along the edge of the woods. He searched for the broken branch Olivia had mentioned. The wind threatened to blow out his lantern. He shielded the glass with his gloved hand. Then he saw it. A massive trunk loomed out of the darkness. A thick branch hung low and splintered near the base. Silas dismounted quickly. He tied the reins to a sturdy sapling. He waded through the deep snow toward the oak. The trunk had a wide split near the roots. It formed a neutral, shallow cave. Silas held the lantern up to the opening. He peered inside the dark hollow. A small bundle of gray wool sat wedged in the farthest corner. Silas crawled into the narrow space. The wind was instantly muffled by the thick wood. He reached out and touched the blanket. The bundle flinched violently. A pale face emerged from the folds of the wool. The boy had wide, terrified blue eyes. He held a heavy stick defensively in front of his chest. Silas did not speak. Olivia had said the boy was deaf. Words would only frighten him more. Silas slowly lowered the lantern. He unfastened his heavy fur mantle. He held the thick pelt open to show his empty hands. The boy pressed himself harder against the bark. He was shivering uncontrollably. His lips were stained blue from the freezing air. Silas moved slowly and deliberately. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of hard bread. He held the bread out on his open palm. The boy stared at the food. Hunger warred with fear in his small face. Silas kept his hand perfectly still. He waited patiently. He had spent years hunting wild beasts in these woods. He knew how to earn trust through stillness. The boy slowly lowered the stick. He reached out a trembling hand and snatched the bread. He began to eat with frantic bites. Silas smiled softly. He pointed to the boy. Then he pointed back out toward the direction of the castle. He made a cradling motion with his arms to mimic holding Olivia. The boy stopped chewing. Recognition flashed in his eyes. He knew Silas came from the woman who saved him. Silas held out his hand. The boy hesitated for a long moment. He looked at the dark storm raging outside the tree. Then he looked at the massive man offering him shelter. The boy dropped the stick and took Silas's hand. Silas pulled the child forward gently. He wrapped his huge fur mantle around the boy's thin shoulders. He lifted the child against his chest. The boy buried his face in the warm fur. Silas backed out of the hollow tree. The storm hit them again immediately. Silas shielded the boy's body with his own bulk. He carried the child to the waiting horse. He climbed into the saddle and situated the boy in front of him. He tucked the boy securely inside the heavy folds of his riding coat. Silas turned the horse back toward the mountain. The ride back was drooling and slow. The snow continued to pile up on the treacherous path. Silas felt the boy's shivering gradually subside against his stomach. The child had fallen asleep from pure exhaustion. The castle gates appeared through the blizzard like a towering shadow. The guards hauled the heavy iron doors open. Silas rode straight into the sheltered courtyard. Stable hands rushed forward to take the exhausted horse. Silas dismounted while holding the sleeping boy carefully. He ignored the murmurs of the gathered soldiers. He walked briskly into the warm corridors of the keep. He did not stop until he reached his private chambers. He kicked the heavy door open. Olivia was sitting up in bed, holding a wooden bowl. She dropped the bowl onto the mattress when she saw him. Silas walked to the fire and set the boy down on a thick rug. The child woke up and blinked at the bright light. He looked around the massive room in confusion. Then he saw Olivia. The boy scrambled to his feet. He ran across the room and threw his arms around her neck. Olivia buried her face in the boy's dirty hair. Tears streamed down her scarred cheeks. She rocked him back and forth against her chest. Silas stood by the fire and watched them. He felt a strange tightening in his throat. He had ruled a kingdom for a decade with absolute authority. He had won wars and executed traitors without blinking. But watching this broken woman hold this rescued child humbled him. Olivia looked up at Silas through her tears. She did not need to speak. Her eyes held a profound gratitude that words could not capture. Silas walked over to the bed. He sat down on the edge of the mattress beside them. He placed his large hand on the back of the boy's head. The child flinched slightly but did not pull away. "He is safe now," Silas promised softly. No one will ever hurt either of you again. Morning broke without bringing any sunlight to the northern keep. The heavy snow clouds kept the sky stained in a deep slate gray. Silas had not slept for a single moment. He sat in the high-backed wooden chair beside the roaring hearth. He spent the entire night watching the bed. He needed to see the rise and fall of Olivia's chest. He needed constant proof that she was breathing. Ellen slept curled against her side like a defensive shield. The boy kept his small fists clenched in the fabric of her quilt. Silas stood up quietly and stretched his back. He ran a hand over his scalp, feeling the familiar texture of his short dark hair. He walked toward the thick glass of the chamber window. The wind howled through the stone battlements outside. Frost crept across the edges of the window pane in jagged patterns. Silas welcomed the harsh weather. The blizzard was a natural fortress keeping his enemies at bay. A soft knock sounded at the heavy oak door. Silas crossed the room with silent, measured steps. He opened the door just enough to slip into the corridor. The royal physician stood waiting with fresh bandages and a leather satchel. Lord Thorne stood right behind the old doctor. Thorne carried a stack of parchment and a deeply worried expression. "How is she, sire?" the physician asked in a hushed tone. "She slept through the night," Silas answered. "The boy slept as well." "I must check her lungs and her frostbite," the physician stated. Silas opened the door wider to let the man pass. Thorne attempted to follow the doctor inside. Silas blocked the doorway with his broad chest. "The Queen is resting," Silas said plainly. "Sire, we must discuss the southern borders," Thorne urged. "The borders can wait until the storm breaks," Silas replied. Thorne shook his head. "The storm has not stopped them, sire." Silas narrowed his eyes. "Speak clearly, Thorne." "Our border patrols caught a man trying to cross the frozen risen before dawn," Thorne explained. "He carried the crest of Lord Malachor." Silas felt a dark, malevolent joy take root in his chest. The prey was marching directly into the wolf's den. "Where is the prisoner?" Silas asked. "In the lower dungeons," Thorne said. "He claims he is a merchant lost in the snow." "He is a scout," Silas corrected. "Malachor sent hunting dogs to track my wife." Thorne blinked in shock. He clearly did not understand the full story yet. "Keep the prisoner awake," Silas ordered. "I will speak to him myself after I break my fast." Silas stepped back and closed the door in Thorne's face. He walked back toward the massive bed. Olivia was sitting up against the pillows. The physician was gently applying a thick herbal paste to her cracked cheeks. She winced slightly at the pressure. Ellen sat at the foot of the bed. The boy watched the old doctor with intense suspicion. Ellen held a brass candlestick gripped tightly in his hands. He was ready to strike if the doctor hurt her. Silas walked over to the boy. He reached out and wrapped his large hand over the brass weapon. Ellen looked up at Silas with wide, defensive eyes. Silas did not pull the candlestick away by force. He simply held it steady and looked calmly into the boy's face. Silas offered a slow, reassuring nod. He pointed to the doctor, then pointed to the healing paste on Olivia's face. He gave a thumbs-up gesture. Ellen stared at the massive man for a long moment. The contrast between them was absolute. Silas possessed the raw strength to snap the brass metal in half. Yet he waited, patiently, for a frightened child to yield. Elian slowly released his grip on the candlestick. Silas took it and set it safely on the side table. "He is fiercely loyal," the physician noted without looking back. "He has kept me alive," Olivia said softly. Her voice was stronger this morning. The warmth of the fire and the safe bed had worked miracles on her exhaustion. A maid entered the room carrying a heavy silver tray. The smell of roasted oats, honey, and fresh baked bread filled the chamber. Elian turned his head toward the door immediately. His stomach growled loud enough to be heard over the crackling fire. Silas took the tray from the maid and dismissed her with a nod. He set the food on the sturdy table near the window. He pulled out 2 wooden chairs. He looked at Elian and motioned toward the food. The boy looked at Olivia for permission. Olivia smiled and nodded at him. Elian scrambled off the bed and ran to the table. He climbed onto the chair and stared at the feast. He had never seen so much food in one place. Silas sat in the chair opposite him. The king took a thick slice of warm bread. He slathered it heavily with sweet butter and berry preserves. He handed the slice across the table to Elian. The boy took it carefully. He bit into the bread, and his eyes widened at the taste of the sugar. Silas poured a cup of warm milk and set it near the boy's plate. "He eats like he has never seen a full meal," the physician murmured. "He hasn't," Olivia replied bitterly. "The southern lords feed their workers just enough to keep them swinging pickaxes." Silas felt the cold anger return to his blood. He watched the boy eat with frantic energy. He imagined this fragile child swinging an iron pickaxe in a dark, collapsing tunnel. The thought demanded violent retribution. "Your lungs are scarred, my queen," the physician announced. He packed his glass vials away into his leather bag. "The dampness of the mines has done lasting damage. Will she recover?" Silas asked sharply. "With rest, clean air, and warm teas, she will regain most of her strength," the doctor said. "But she must never endure such labor again." "She is the queen," Silas stated. "Her only labor will be deciding which of my gardens she prefers to walk in." Olivia offered a small, genuine smile. "Thank you, doctor," she said. The physician bowed deeply and exited the chamber. Silas walked over to the bed. He sat on the mattress beside her. He reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair away from her face. "You look better today," Silas said. "I feel human again," Olivia admitted. She looked past his shoulder toward the table. Elian was methodically wiping his plate clean with a final crust of bread. "He likes you," Olivia noted. "He likes the honey," Silas corrected. "He gave you his weapon," she pointed out. "That means he trusts you to protect us." Silas looked back at the boy. Elian was watching them quietly while chewing. The boy noticed Silas looking and offered a shy, sticky smile. Silas felt a strange, protective weight settle into his soul. He had spent 10 years conquering lands to fill an empty void in his chest. He had burned cities and claimed crowns. None of it gave him the profound satisfaction of watching this orphan eat in safety. "Malakor's men have crossed the border," Silas said quietly. He did not want to ruin her peace, but he refused to lie to her. Olivia stiffened against the pillows. The fear returned to her hazel eyes instantly. "They tracked us through the storm?" "They sent a scout," Silas explained. "My patrols intercepted him by the river." Olivia grabbed his arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "You must not let them take Elian, Silas. Malakor claims ownership of all orphans born on his lands. He will demand the boy's return under the Southern treaties." Silas placed his large hand over hers. "I wiped my blood on those treaties 5 years ago. Malakor has no authority in the north. If he wants the boy,
He will have to pry him from my dead hands. Olivia searched his face for any trace of doubt. She found only absolute, terrifying certainty. Silas stood up from the bed. He walked to the heavy wooden armoire in the corner of the room. He pulled open the doors. He reached past his silk tunics and velvet cloaks. He pulled out a heavy black leather gambeson and iron chainmail. "Where are you going?" Olivia asked. "I am going to the dungeons," Silas answered. He pulled the padded armor over his broad shoulders. "I need to ask the scout how many men rode with him." "Will he tell you?" Silas picked up his heavy steel broadsword. He fastened the leather scabbard to his belt. "He will tell me everything," Silas promised. He walked back to the bed and leaned down. He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Stay in this room."
To keep the door bolted. He looked over at Elian. The boy was watching the sword at Silas's waist with wide eyes. Silas pointed to the heavy door. He made a locking motion with his hand. Elian nodded seriously. The child understood the need for vigilance. Silas turned and walked out of the chamber. He heard the heavy iron bolt slide into place behind him. He walked down the winding stone stairs toward the lower levels. The air grew colder and damper with every step. The torches on the walls flickered in the draft. He reached the heavy iron grate of the dungeon entrance. 2 armored guards stood at attention. They opened the gate without a word. Silas stepped into the dim stone hallway. The smell of old blood and rusted iron hung thick in the air. He walked toward the last cell on the right. Thorn and the captain of the guard were waiting outside the iron bars. Inside the cell, a man sat chained to a heavy wooden chair. The prisoner wore heavy southern furs. His face was bruised from the struggle with the border patrols. "He refuses to speak, sire," the captain reported. "He insists he is a spice trader." Silas unlocked the cell door himself. He stepped inside the cramped stone room. The prisoner looked up with a defiant sneer. "You cannot hold me here," the prisoner spat. "I claim protection under the Merchant Guild." Silas did not draw his sword. He did not raise his voice. He simply grabbed the heavy wooden chair with one hand. He dragged the chair, with the man still chained to it, closer to the torchlight. The wood scraped horribly against the stone floor. Silas leaned over the prisoner. His massive frame blocked out all the light. "You do not smell like spices," Silas said. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble. "You smell like wet dog and cheap iron." The prisoner swallowed hard. The defiance in his eyes wavered. "I am looking for a runaway servant," the scout admitted quickly. "And a stolen boy. They belong to Lord Malachor." Silas placed his heavy hands on the armrests of the chair. He leaned closer until their faces were inches apart. "You are looking for the Queen of the North," Silas whispered. Crypt, the scout's eyes widened in sheer horror. "The Queen?" he stammered. "That is impossible." "I am now going to get a gent. I'm a stitter for the once," the scout admitted quickly. "And a stolen boy. They belong to Lord Malachor." Silas placed his heavy hands on the armrests of the chair. He leaned closer until their faces were inches apart. "You are looking for the Queen of the North," Silas whispered. The scout's eyes widened in sheer horror. "The Queen?" he stammered. "That is impossible." "Tell me how many men Malachor sent to my borders," Silas benamed. "If you lie, I will feed you to the wolves." The scout trembled violently in his chains. 300, he choked out. 300 riders. They are waiting for my signal at the mountain pass. Silas stood up straight. He looked at Thorn standing outside the cell. "Sound the war horns," Silas commanded. The time for grieving was over. The time for slaughter had begun. The war horns shattered the morning silence. The deep brass motes echoed off the icy mountains and vibrated through the floorboards. Silas strode through the armory with purposeful and heavy strides. Squires scrambled to hand him his steel gauntlets and leather straps. He fastened the thick belts over his forearms without looking down at his hands. His generals gathered rapidly around a large wooden map table in the center of the room. Thorn pointed to a narrow ravine drawn in black ink on the parchment. "The southern riders will use the Wolf's Throat Pass," Thorn explained sharply. "It is the only route wide enough for 300 horses in this deep snow." Silas stared at the ink lines marking the treacherous ravine. "They think the storm hides their approach from our scouts," Silas said. "We will show them. The storm belongs entirely to the north." He ordered his heavy cavalry to saddle their largest war horses immediately. He did not want archers or foot soldiers to slow down this particular maneuver. This was not a defensive siege designed to protect the tassel walls. This was an execution meant to send a permanent message to the south. Silas left the bustling armory and walked back up the winding stone stairs. He needed to see his wife one more time before he rode into the blinding blizzard. He knocked twice on the heavy oak door of his private chambers. The iron bolts slid back with a loud metallic clank. Olivia pulled the door open carefully and peered into the dim corridor. She looked at his heavy battle armor and understood the situation instantly. "They are coming up the mountain," she said quietly. "They are already dead," Silas corrected with absolute certainty. He stepped into the warm room and closed the heavy door behind him. Elian sat near the roaring fire holding a carved wooden toy horse. The boy looked up at the king's terrifying iron breastplate with wide eyes. Silas knelt down on the stone floor so he was exactly at eye level with the child. He removed his heavy steel helmet and set it gently onto the rug. He reached out and tapped the wooden toy in Elian's small hand. "I am going to hunt the men who hurt you," Silas sighed, using a simple, clear gesture. Elian stared deeply into the dark, serious eyes of the towering king. The boy reached out cautiously and touched the cold iron of Silas's chest plate. Elian nodded once, and his small face hardened with sudden, unexpected bravery. Silas stood up slowly and turned his attention back to Olivia. She stepped close and rested her warm hands firmly on his armored shoulders. "Do not let Malakor's men breach the lower gates," she whispered fiercely. "They will never live long enough to see the gates," Silas promised her. He leaned down and kissed her deeply in the quiet room. It was a kiss of profound ownership and unspoken, violent devotion. He tasted the lingering honey from her morning bread on her soft lips. The sweet taste grounded him perfectly in the reality of what he was fighting to protect. He pulled away reluctantly and picked up his helmet. "Bar the door behind me," Silas commanded. He did not wait to hear the heavy lock slide back into place. He was already walking swiftly toward the freezing courtyard. 200 armored riders waited for him in the deep, blowing snow. Their black war horses stamped impatiently against the icy cobblestones. Silas mounted his own massive stallion with a fluid, practiced motion. He drew his broadsword and held it high above his helmet. The polished steel caught the dull gray light of the winter storm. He spurred his horse forward through the made iron gates of the keep. The heavy cavalry thundered out of the castle in a tight, disciplined formation. They rode hard and fast toward the Wolf's Throat Pass. The raging blizzard effectively masked the thundering sound of their heavy hooves. The ravine was a deep cut in the jagged mountainside. Steep rock walls rose vertically on either side of the narrow, winding path. Silas halted his men at the highest ridge overlooking the entry to the pass. They waited in the freezing wind in absolute, disciplined silence. The cold bit harshly through their leather tunics, but not a single man complained. An hour passed slowly before the first southern riders appeared through the whiteout. They rode in a disorganized, shivering column. They looked miserable, exhausted, and half-frozen in their saddles. Malacor's men were simply not bred for the brutal northern winters. They wore thin chainmail and cheap fur collars that offered no real protection. Silas watched them march deeper and deeper into his natural trap. He waited patiently until the entire column was wedged tightly between the rock walls. Then he raised his broadsword and spurred his warhorse straight over the snowy ridge. 200 northern riders charged down the steep slope as one unit. The sound of their unified descent was like an avalanche of iron and crushing muscle. The southern scouts looked up in sudden, paralyzed terror. They tried desperately to draw their weapons, but their fingers were numb and useless. Silas hit the enemy vanguard with devastating, unstoppable force. His massive warhorse trampled 2 southern riders into the snow immediately. Silas swung his broadsword in a deadly, sweeping arc. He did not aim to wound or capture anyone today. He aimed to eradicate the threat completely. The sharp clash of steel rang sharply through the frozen, echoing ravine. The northern heavy cavalry crushed the disorganized Southerners with terrifying ease. It was not a strategic battle of wits. It was a grim, mechanical harvest. Silas moved through the mounting chaos like a shadow of pure retribution. He felt absolutely no pity for the men screaming in the trampled snow. These were the same men who hunted a scarred woman and a deaf child for sport. They deserved nothing but the cold abyss waiting for them. His heavy blade flashed relentlessly in the dim winter light. He tore through their breaking ranks with terrifying, calculated precision. The Southern captain tried frantically to rally his fleeing men near the back of the column. Silas spotted the man's med cloaked and rode straight toward him through the carnage. 3 loyal soldiers stepped into his path to protect their shouting commander. Silas dispatched them instantly with 3 brutal, highly efficient strikes. He pulled his heavy horse up right beside the terrified Southern captain. The man raised a wooden shield instinctively to block the incoming blow. Silas shattered the painted shield into splinters with a single overhead swing. The heavy impact sent the captain tumbling backward out of his leather saddle. Silas dismounted quickly and walked deliberately toward the fallen man. The remaining Southern forces finally broke formation and began to scatter completely. They abandoned their swords and fled blindly back toward the southern roads. Silas did not order his men to chase the fleeing cowards. He wanted those terrified survivors to carry his message all the way back to Malachor. The northern riders moved methodically to secure the ends of the ravine. The pristine white snow was now heavily trampled and stained dark. Silas stood silently over the trembling Southern captain. The man crawled backward in the snow, weeping and pleading for mercy. "My lord Malachor will pay a king's ransom for my life," the captain shouted desperately. Silas stepped firmly on the man's armored chest to pin him to the frozen ground. "I do not want his gold," Silas said evenly. His deep voice cut easily through the howling, bitter wind. "I want his fear." Silas knelt down and grabbed the captain roughly by the front of his torn tunic. "You will walk back to your master on foot," Silas ordered. "You will tell him the North is permanently closed to his kind." The captain nodded frantically, his teeth chattering in fear and cold. "I will tell him. I swear it on my life. Tell him the woman and the boy belong to the king," Silas continued mercilessly. "Tell him if he ever sends armed men across my borders again, I will not stop at the river." Silas leaned closer, his eyes black and completely merciless. "I will ride south myself and turn his precious iron mines into his tomb." He released the trembling man and stood up to his full, imposing height. "Run," Silas commanded simply. The captain scrambled awkwardly to his feet and sprinted blindly into the blizzard. Silas watched him disappear into the dense whiteout of the storm. He wiped his bloodied blade clean on a discarded southern banner. He slid the heavy sword smoothly back into its dark leather scabbard. He looked around calmly at the grim aftermath of his righteous wrath. His men were already gathering the abandoned horses and usable weapons. Not a single northern rider had fallen in the brief skirmish. The sheer, overwhelming violence of the ambush had broken the enemy's spirit instantly. Silas mounted his warhorse again, with a feeling of deep, dark satisfaction settling in his bones. He would spend 10 miserable years directing his anger at the empty, uncaring world. Now, he finally had a worthy target for his rage. He turned his horse back toward the distant silhouette of the castle. He wanted to be sitting by the warm fire before Olivia started to worry. Inside the royal chambers, the air remained suffocatingly tense. Olivia sat perfectly still near the window, staring out at the gray storm. She could not see the hidden ravine from this angle of the keep. She could only imagine the horrific violence taking place in the mountain snow. Elian sat quietly on the thick rug right beside her wooden chair. He leaned against her leg, seeking warmth and constant comfort. He could not hear the violent wind crashing against the stone outside. He could only feel the faint vibrations of the heavy floorboards beneath him. Olivia placed her hand gently on the boy's thin shoulder. She remembered the brutal, back-breaking labor of the southern mines vividly. She remembered the cruel overseers ripping the exhausted workers without mercy. She knew Silas was currently dismantling that cruelty with absolute, unforgiving force. A gentle, civilized part of her hated the necessity of such violence. But a deeper, older part of her felt a fierce, unapologetic gratitude. For a decade, she had relied on absolutely no one but herself to survive. She had clawed her way out of the darkness of the crypt alone. Now she was finally allowing someone else to carry the heaviest burden. She closed her hazel eyes and rested her head against the high back of the chair. She trusted Silas completely with her life and the boy's future. He would never fail them. An hour later, the deep, resonant sound of the war horns drifted over the castle walls. It was a single, sustained note signaling a highly victorious return. Olivia opened her eyes immediately and stood up from the chair. Elian leaped up at her quickly, sensing the sudden shift in her posture. She smiled warmly down at the boy and nodded encouragingly toward the door. She walked over to the heavy iron bolt and slid it open with trembling hands. She stood in the open doorway and waited patiently. She heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of armored boots climbing the steep stone stairs. Silas turned the corner of the dim corridor a moment later. His armor was slightly dented and streaked with dark ash from the battle. He looked exhausted and incredibly terrifying. But when he saw her standing in the doorway, his entire demeanor softened instantly. He unfastened his helmet and dropped it carelessly onto the stone floor. He walked toward her with heavy, determined steps. He stopped just inches away, refusing to touch her with his dirty gauntlets. "It is done," Silas said quietly. "They are gone." Olivia reached out fearlessly and touched his cold, armored chest. She did not care about the dirt or the freezing iron. She stepped completely into his space and wrapped her arms tight around his waist. Silas let out a long, ragged exhale of pure relief. He buried his face deeply in her dark, fragrant hair. He wrapped his arms carefully around her delicate back. He held her tight enough to feel safe, but gentle enough not to hurt her healing lungs. Elian peeked out cautiously from behind the thick wooden doorframe. The boy saw the terrifying warrior holding the woman who saved him so tenderly. Elian walked forward slowly and wrapped his small arms around Silas's armored leg. The King of the North stood completely still in the quiet hallway. He held the only two people in the entire world who mattered to him. The storm still raged fiercely outside, but inside these stone walls, the 10-year winter was finally over. Silas gently stepped back from the embrace in the cold corridor. He led Olivia and Ilian back into the warm royal chambers. He smelled heavily of sweat and cold iron. He did not want his dirty armor to soil her clean bandages. He walked into the adjoining stone washroom and shut the door. Two young squires rushed in moments later to help him undress. The heavy chainmail clattered loudly against the wet stone floor. Silas dismissed the squires with a quick wave of his hand. He poured a heavy clay pitcher of cold water directly over his head. The icy shock washed away the lingering adrenaline of the morning slaughter. He scrubbed the dried blood from his jawline with a rough linen towel. He looked at his own reflection in the polished silver mirror. The deep lines of stress around his eyes were still visible. He had aged a decade in pure grief, but the terrifying, hollow emptiness was finally gone from his stare. In the main chamber, maids filled a deep copper tub with steaming water. They crushed dried lavender and rose petals into the hot basin. Olivia stood near the hearth and let her rag-lithe and tunic fall to the floor. The maids gasped softly at the sight of her bare back. Raised red scars crisscrossed her pale skin from the whips of the southern overseers. Olivia ignored their shocked murmurs completely. She stepped into the hot water with a long, shuddering sigh. The intense heat seeped slowly into her aching bones. The maids gently washed her dark hair with scented oils. They scrubbed the sovereign iron dust from her knuckles and fingernails. Elian sat on the thick rug nearby. The boy watched the bathing process with mild confusion. A separate wooden basin was brought in for the child. Silas re-entered the room wearing a simple white tunic and dark trousers. He rolled up his long sleeves and knelt beside Elian's basin. The boy shrank back slightly from the soapy water. Silas picked up a soft sea sponge from the floor. He washed the boy's face with slow, deliberate strokes. He worked carefully around the dark bruises on Elian's thin arms. Hours passed in quiet, domestic peace. The blizzard continued to batter the thick windows outside. The massive fire kept the chamber stiflingly warm and safe. The head seamstress arrived carrying an armful of heavy velvet gowns. She had spent the morning urgently altering Olivia's old dresses. Olivia chose a deep crimson gown trimmed in thick black fur. It was the traditional color of the northern royal house. The heavy fabric hid the bandages on her shoulders perfectly. A maid pinned her dark hair up in a severe, elegant braid. Olivia looked at herself in the tall, standing mirror. She looked older and sharper than the girl who died 10 years ago. She was no longer a sheltered princess. She was a battle-tested survivor. Elian was dressed in a dark wool tunic and soft leather boots. The clothes were entirely too clean for his liking. He kept pulling at the stiff wool collar uncomfortably. Silas walked up behind Olivia and placed his large hands on her waist. He met her gaze in the mirror reflection. He did not need to speak to convey his overwhelming pride. The heavy wooden clock in the hallway chimed 6 times. It was time for the evening meal. Silas usually dreaded this specific hour of the day. Tonight, he felt a strange, thrilling anticipation. Lord Thorne knocked hesitantly on the heavy chamber door. Silas opened it only halfway to block the view. Thorne kept his eyes firmly fixed on the king's face. He asked if the king would take his meal in his private quarters tonight. Silas shook his head firmly. He announced that the queen would dine in the great hall. Thorne turned pale and swallowed hard. The advisor bowed quickly and rushed off to inform the head steward. Silas turned back to his wife and offered her his arm.
Olivia rested her small hand securely on his muscular forearm. Silas reached down and took Elian's hand with his other hand. They walked out of the warm room together. The descent down the main stone staircase felt incredibly momentous. Guards snapped to rigid attention the moment they passed by.
Servants stopped in the corridors and pressed their backs against the walls. They stared at the woman in the crimson gown with open disbelief. Whispers swept through the castle, faster than the winter wind. Olivia kept her chin held high and her posture perfect. She remembered exactly how to walk with absolute authority. She squeezed Silas's arm slightly when they reached the great hall. The armored guards hauled the massive oak doors open. The great hall was packed tightly with northern nobility. The loud chatter died instantly the moment the heavy doors opened. Complete silence smothered the enormous, echoing room. Hundreds of anxious eyes turned toward the entrance. Silas walked down the center aisle with slow, commanding steps. Olivia walked perfectly, in time with his measured pace. Elian stayed glued to Silas's leg, clearly intimidated by the massive crowd. The lords and ladies stared openly at the queen's face. They searched frantically for the familiar features of the dead woman. They saw the recognizable hazel eyes and the proud jawline. They also saw the harsh lines of suffering that no magic could fake. Lord Thorne stood rigidly near the high table. His old hands trembled as he watched the trio approach the dais. They reached the raised wooden platform at the front of the hall. The head steward scrambled to pull out Silas's heavy wooden chair. Silas ignored the trembling servant completely. He walked straight to the chair on his right side. It was the chair that had sat empty for 10 grueling years. He pulled it out himself with a loud scrape of wood. Olivia stepped forward and sat down gracefully onto the velvet cushion. Silas pushed the heavy chair in for her. He then pulled up a smaller wooden chair to his left side. He lifted Elian easily and set the boy down onto the seat. Finally, Silas took his own place in the center of the table. The entire court remained standing in stunned, breathless silence. Silas looked out over the vast sea of pale faces. He did not raise his voice or offer any explanation. He simply commanded them to sit. The nobles scrambled to their chairs in a chaotic rush. The evening meal commenced with awkward, heavy tension. No one dared to speak above a frightened, muffled whisper. Servants moved quickly to distribute the roasted meats and root vegetables. A young boy approached the high table carrying a golden serving platter. He stopped near Olivia's place setting and froze in terror. For 10 years he had been trained to place food on an empty plate and walk away. Olivia looked at the fresh roasted venison resting on the platter. She picked up her heavy silver fork from the table. She reached out and took a generous portion of meat for herself. The young servant exhaled sharply in immense relief and backed away. Olivia picked up the silver goblet that had collected dust for a decade. A maid quickly rushed forward and filled it with the dark red wine. Olivia took a long, satisfying sip from the rim. The wine was rich and deeply warming to her throat. Silas watched her eat in quiet fascination. He did not bother to touch his own food. He simply stared at her delicate profile in the flickering candlelight. Olivia felt his heavy gaze burning into her skin. She turned her head and met his dark, intense eyes. She picked up a piece of warm bread from the basket. She broke it in half and placed one piece squarely on his gold plate. She told him to eat his dinner. She reminded him that his food was getting cold. Silas looked down at the torn bread on his plate. A genuine, unrestrained smile broke across his face for the first time in 10 years. The rare expression completely transformed his terrifying, war-hardened features. Several lords sitting down the table gasped softly at the sight.
They had never seen the tyrant king look so remarkably human. Silas picked up the bread and took a large bite. The hollow space in his chest was permanently sealed. The silver plate beside him would never be empty again. The dinner hall remained painfully quiet as Silas ate his bread. Dozens of nobles watched the high table with unblinking eyes. They were looking for any sign of deception. 10 years of grief had made the northern court paranoid. Lord Callan pushed his chair back from the wooden table. The loud scrape of wood against stone echoed sharply. Callan was a harsh man who ruled the eastern watchtowers. He had fought alongside Silas during the early border wars. He did not trust the miraculous return of a dead woman. Callan stood up and raised his heavy silver goblet. He directed his dark gaze straight toward the queen. "We rejoice at this impossible reunion," Callan began loudly. His voice dripped with thick, undisguised suspicion. "But the South is known for dark witchcraft and clever spies."
Silas stopped chewing his food instantly. He slowly placed his bread down on the gold plate. The temperature in the great hall seemed to plummet. Everyone recognized the specific stillness that preceded Silas's violence. Olivia placed her hand gently over Silas's thick wrist. She pressed down just enough to keep him seated. She would not let him kill a man for asking a logical question. She needed to conquer this court herself. "Speak your mind, Callan," Olivia commanded clearly. Her voice carried easily to the back of the silent room. Callan stepped away from his table and walked toward the center aisle. 10 years ago, the Queen negotiated the Iron Pact, Callan said. She met with the Western warlords in this very hall. Callan narrowed his eyes at her scarred face. "What did you offer them to secure their loyalty?" It was a brilliant and dangerous trap. The official record stated the Western lords were paid in silver. Only the inner circle knew the actual price of the treaty. Silas shifted his weight in his heavy chair. He was ready to draw his sword and separate Callan's head from his shoulders. Olivia did not blink. She looked down at the suspicious lord with absolute calm. "I did not offer them silver," Olivia answered smoothly. "I offered them the heads of their own traitorous uncles." The great hall erupted into frantic, shocked whispers. "I had the heads delivered in 3 cedar boxes," she continued. Her voice sliced through the noise like a sharp blade. "I packed the boxes with coarse salt myself. The Western warlords signed the treaty before the salt could melt." Callan turned completely pale. The official historians had never recorded that brutal detail. He knew instantly that the woman sitting on the dais was no spy. She was the ruthless architect of the northern expansion. Callan immediately dropped to one knee on the hard stone floor. He bowed his head in deep, terrified submission. "Forgive my insolence, my queen," Callan choked out. "I only sought to protect the crown." Silas finally stood up from his chair. His tall shadow stretched aggressively across the raised platform. He looked down at the kneeling lord with cold disdain. "You questioned my wife in front of my court?" Silas said. His low voice made several nearby ladies flinch. "You are lucky she is in a merciful mood tonight." Silas pointed toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall. "Leave this castle before the storm breaks. If I see your face tomorrow, I will take your tongue." Callan scrabbled to his feet without hesitation. He turned and walked swiftly out of the room. No one spoke as the heavy doors slammed shut behind him. Silas sat back down and picked up his goblet. He looked at the remaining nobles with a challenging stare. "Does anyone else need a history lesson?" Silas asked. The entire court immediately looked down at their plates. They began to eat their roasted meat in terrified silence. Olivia let out a slow, quiet breath. She felt a deep ache in her healing lungs.
The adrenaline of the confrontation was fading quickly. She leaned slightly closer to Silas. "You did not have to banish him," she whispered. "He is a loyal commander." "He is a fool who forgot his place," Silas replied. "Loyalty means nothing without respect." He reached under the table and found her hand. He intertwined his scarred fingers with hers. "You handled him perfectly," Silas admitted. "I remembered the cedar boxes," Olivia said softly. "The smell of the salt stayed in my clothes for weeks." Ilian pulled gently on Olivia's velvet sleeve. He pointed toward the large hearth at the side of the hall. He rubbed his eyes with his small fists. The boy was exhausted from the long day. Silas nodded and stood up. He pushed his chair back and offered Olivia his hand. "The meal is finished," Silas announced to the room. The lords and ladies stood up instantly to show their respect. Silas led his family away from the high table. They walked back up the center aisle together. The heavy tension in the room broke the moment they left. They walked down the dim Hayad toward the royal stairs. The torches flickered wildly from the drafts creeping through the stone. Ilian walked slightly ahead of them. He dragged his hand along the cold wall as he walked. Suddenly, a massive shadow detached itself from a dark alcove. A deep, vibrating growl echoed through the tight hallway. Silas instinctively stepped in from Olivia. He reached for the heavy dagger strapped to his belt. It was one of the northern warhounds. The beast was the size of a small calf. It had thick, gray fur and terrifying yellow eyes. The hounds were trained to kill intruders on sight. This one had somehow slipped away from the kennels. The hound bared its sharp teeth and lowered its heavy head. It locked its predatory gaze onto the small boy. Ilian did not scream. He could not hear the aggressive growling. He simply stopped walking and stared at the massive animal. Silas prepared to lunge forward and drive his dagger into the hound's neck. He would not let the beast harm the child. Before Silas could move, Ilian took a step forward. Olivia gasped and tried to reach for the boy. Silas blocked her arm. He watched the boy with sudden, intense curiosity. Ilian did not show any fear. He reached into the deep pocket of his wool tunic. He pulled out a thick chunk of roasted venison. He had saved the meat from his dinner plate. Ilian held the meat out on his flat palm. He stood perfectly still in the flickering torchlight. He offered the wild beast the same grace Silas had offered him in the hollow tree. The warhound stopped growling. It sniffed the edder cautiously. The scent of fresh meat overpowered its aggressive instincts. The massive dog took a slow step toward the boy. Silas kept his grip tight on his dagger handle. He was ready to strike if the beast snapped. The hound lowered its heavy head to the boy's hand. It took the venison gently with its front teeth. The dog swallowed the meat in a single gulp. Ilian did not pull his hand away. He slowly raised his arm and placed his palm on the hound's thick neck. He buried his small fingers into the coarse gray fur. The terrifying beast let out a soft huff of air. It leaned its heavy head against Ilian's chest. The boy smiled and scratched the dog behind its torn ears. Silas slowly released the hilt of his dagger. He looked at the deaf orphan with newfound respect. "He tamed a killer with table scraps," Silas murmured. "He understands hunger," Olivia replied quietly. "Hunger makes monsters out of all of us." Silas stepped forward and approached the hound. The dog tensed slightly at the king's presence. Silas placed his large hand firmly on the beast's back. He established his own dominance over the animal without violence. The hound whined softly and sat down on the stone floor. Ilian looked up at Silas with bright, triumphant eyes. The boy pointed to the dog,
and then pointed to himself. He was asking to keep the massive beast. Silas let out a low, rumbling laugh. The sound echoed warmly in the cold stone corridor. "You may keep him," Silas signed with his hands. "He will sleep at the foot of your bed." Elian beamed and hugged the dog's thick neck. Olivia walked forward and wrapped her arm around Silas's waist. "You are building an army of strays," she teased softly. "I am building a family," Silas corrected her. They continued their walk toward the royal chambers. The massive hound padded quietly behind the small boy. It acted as a dedicated, silent guardian. They reached the heavy oak doors of their quarters. Silas pushed the door open and let them enter first. The fire was still burning brightly in the large stone hearth. The chamber felt like a sanctuary against the raging winter. Elian walked straight toward a thick pile of furs near the fire. The boy collapsed onto the rugs with complete exhaustion. The warhound circled twice before lying down right beside him. The beast rested its heavy chin over the boy's legs. Olivia watched them settle with a soft, peaceful expression. She walked toward the large window and looked out at the storm. The snow was still falling heavily over the northern mountains. The southern warlords were a distant memory tonight. Silas walked up behind her and wrapped his arms around her shoulders. He pulled her back firmly against his broad chest. He rested his chin on the top of her dark head. "The court belongs to you again," Silas said. "Kaelin will spread the story of the cedar boxes by morning. They will fear you more than they fear me." Olivia leaned her weight fully against his strong frame. "I do not want them to fear me, Silas. I just want them to leave us in peace." Silas tightened his grip around her waist. "Peace is a luxury earned through spilled blood. I will spill oceans to keep you safe." Olivia turned around in his arms to face him. She reached up and traced the heiss lines of his jaw. "You do not have to fight the entire world anymore. I am not hiding in a wooden box. I am right here." Silas closed his eyes and leaned into her touch. He let the last 10 years of crushing anxiety wash away. He was finally awake from the long, dark nightmare. He picked her up effortlessly in his arms. He carried her toward the massive feather bed. The storm raged outside, but Silas had already won his war. The long blizzard finally broke just before dawn. Pale sunlight pierced the thick glass of the chamber windows. Silas woke before the castle servants started their morning fires. He lay perfectly still on the mattress. Olivia slept with her head resting on his shoulder. Her breathing sounded much clearer today. The warm, herbal pastes had soothed her damaged lungs. Silas traced the faint outline of her jaw with his thumb. He felt a profound shift in his own chest. The crushing, decade-long despair had vanished. He slipped out of bed without disturbing her. He dressed quickly in a dark tunic and heavy leather boots. Elian was already awake by the hearth. The boy sat cross-legged on the thick rug. He traced the deep scars on the sleeping hound's muzzle. Silas walked over and knelt beside the child. He tapped Elian on the shoulder. The boy looked up with bright eyes. Silas gestured toward the heavy oak door. It was time to secure the boy's future. They walked down to the royal armory together. The massive hound followed closely at their heels. Silas sent a guard to wake Lord Thorn. He demanded a full council meeting before noon. He needed to strike while the fear of his recent slaughter still infected the nobility. Thorn arrived in the great hall looking exhausted. Dozens of lords filed into the room with anxious faces. They saw Silas sitting on his wooden throne. Elian stood right beside the king's knee. The warhound sat like a stone gargoyle at the boy's feet. Silas did not wait for formal introductions. He stood up and looked at his assembled court. He pointed down at the deaf child. "This is Elian," Silas declared clearly. "He is under my protection." The lords nodded in quick agreement. "He is also my son," Silas added. A heavy silence fell over the room. Thorn stepped forward with a deep frown. "Sire, you cannot claim a southern peasant as royal blood." "I just did," Silas replied evenly. Lord Vance stepped out from the back of the crowd. "The law requires a bloodline connection for inheritance," Vance argued. Silas rested his hand on the hilt of his sword. "I wrote that law with the blood of my enemies. I will rewrite it today." Vance swallowed hard and backed away. "Malachor will petition the High Council," Thorn warned. "He will claim you stole his property." Silas walked down the steps of the dais. He stopped directly in front of Thorn. "Malachor sent armed men into my territory. That is a formal act of war. He forfeited his right to petition anyone. Elian stays here as the royal heir." Silas looked around the silent room. "Does any man wish to challenge my succession?" No one moved a single muscle. They remembered the frozen carnage in the ravine. Silas turned his back on them. He reached down and offered his hand to Elian. The boy took it without any hesitation. They left the hall and walked into the bright courtyard. The fresh snow was deep and blindingly white. Guards were shoveling wide paths between the iron gates. Silas led Elian to the wooden training posts. He picked up a small wooden practice sword from a rack. He held it out to the boy. Elian looked at the weapon with obvious uncertainty. Silas knelt in the snow. He adjusted Elian's grip on the wooden hilt. He moved the boy's feet into a stable fighting stance. Olivia watched them from the upper stone balcony. She wore a thick fur cloak against the morning chill. She smiled as Silas patiently corrected the boy's posture. He was a brutal killer on the battlefield. Yet he was infinitely gentle with the broken child. Silas drew his own steel broadsword. The weapon was nearly as tall as Elian. Silas moved in slow, exaggerated motions. He let Elian block his strokes with the wooden stick. The boy's face lit up with a fierce grin. Elian swung back at the king's armored legs. Silas pretended to stumble backward in sudden defeat. Elian laughed without making a sound. Olivia felt hot tears prick her eyes. She wiped them away with her gloved hand. She turned and walked back inside the warm castle. She needed to prepare for their future. They had won the immediate battle against the scouts, but they had to rebuild their lives from the ashes. She walked past the guards and entered the royal library. She pulled old ledgers and map from the dusty shelves. She began to calculate the grain stores and winter rations. She was the queen of the north. Her people needed her sharp mind again. Silas entered the library an hour later. He brushed white snow from his dark hair. He leaned over the wooden table and looked at her notes. "You should be resting," Silas said softly. "I rested for 10 years," Olivia replied. She pointed a finger to a thin line on the map. "Malachor controls the southern iron trade. We need to secure a new supply from the eastern mountains." Silas pulled a wooden chair up beside her. He studied the map with intense focus. "I banished Kalen last night," Silas noted. "He controls the eastern trade routes." "Then we will tax his shipments heavily," Olivia suggested. "He will pay the tax out of sheer gratitude that you let him live." Silas smiled and kissed her scarred cheek. "You are far more ruthless than I am." "I learned from the best," she answered. The heavy library door creaked open.
Elian ran into the room carrying his wooden sword. The warhound trotted lazily behind him.
The boy dropped his weapon and climbed onto Silas's lap. He pointed eagerly to the map on the table. Silas wrapped his large arms securely around the child. He pointed to the northern keep drawn in black ink. He signed the specific word for home with his hand. Elian copied the gesture perfectly. He rested his head against Silas's broad chest. The hound curled up under the table near Olivia's feet. The room was quiet and warm. Silas looked down at the boy in his arms. He felt the steady rhythm of Elian's small heart. He looked across the table at Olivia's focused face. She was already drafting new trade decrees. Her spirit remained unbroken despite a decade of torment. Silas realized his own healing was finally complete. He had spent his life dealing in death and retribution. Now he had something precious to nurture. Thorn appeared in the doorway, holding a sealed parchment. The advisor looked hesitant to interrupt the peaceful scene. "Enter, Thorn," Silas commanded. Thorn stepped into the library and bowed. "A messenger bird arrived from the southern borders, sire." Silas extended his hand. Thorn handed him the rolled parchment. Silas broke the wax seal with his thumb. He unrolled the message and read it in silence. Olivia watched his face for any sign of anger. Silas simply dropped the parchment onto the table. "The southern captain reached Melicor's camp," Silas explained. "He delivered my message." "What is Melicor's response?" Olivia asked. Silas leaned back in his chair. "He has withdrawn his remaining forces from Mordor. He promises to respect the northern sovereignty." Olivia let out a long breath of relief. "He is terrified of you," she said. "He should be," Silas replied. He picked up a quill from the inkstand. He handed the feather pen to Elian. The boy gripped it awkwardly in his small fist. Silas guided the child's hand over a blank piece of parchment. He helped Elian draw the crude shape of a wolf. It was the royal crest of their new family. Thorn watched the exchange with quiet realization. The king was not merely making a political point. Silas truly intended to raise this boy as a ruler. "Draft a formal decree, Thorn," Silas instructed without looking up. "Send copies to every lord and minor baron. They will swear fealty to Elian by the summer solstice." Thorn bowed deeply. "It will be done, sire." The advisor backed out of the room and closed the door. Olivia reached across the table and touched Silas's wrist. "He will be a good king one day," she whispered. "He knows how to survive," Silas agreed. "And he knows the value of mercy." Elian finished his drawing and held it up proudly. Silas nodded and patted the boy's head. The brutal chapters of their past were finally closed. The future lay before them, unwritten and secure. Spring finally broke the frozen spine of the northern mountains. The deep snowbanks melted into rushing rivers of clear, freezing water. Green shoots pushed aggressively through the dark soil of the courtyard. The castle windows were thrown open to welcome the fresh breeze. The smell of wet earth and pine replaced the stale smoke of the winter hearths. The heavy iron gates of the keep remained open during the daylight hours. Merchants from the southern valleys arrived with carts of fresh produce. The lower village bustled with renewed energy and loud commerce. The north was waking up from a decade of forced hibernation. Olivia walked through the royal gardens without a heavy cloak. She wore a simple dress of light blue wool. Her lungs were completely clear. The harsh, dry cough that haunted her early days was gone entirely. Her face had filled out. The frostbite scars faded into thin, pale lines against her healthy skin.
She looked stronger than she had a decade ago. She spent her mornings in the council chambers. She reviewed every tax ledger and trade agreement signed during her absence. She quietly overturned Silas's most brutal wartime decrees. She offered tax relief to the villages that suffered the worst winter crop failures. The common people began to call her the Dawn Queen. They recognized that her return had saved them from their king's endless wrath. Silas watched her from the open doorway of the armory. He wiped the thick oil from his hands with a linen rag. He had spent the morning maintaining his armor, but he had no plans to wear it. His heavy steel broadsword hung silently on the stone wall. The borders were completely secure. Malachor kept his men far south of the river out of sheer terror. The eastern lords paid their new taxes without a single complaint. The north was experiencing a rare, profound era of true peace. Silas tossed the dirty rag onto a wooden bench. He walked out into the bright sunlight to join his wife. He did not wear his heavy iron crown today. He felt no need to intimidate his own household. The massive gray warhound trotted lazily a few steps behind him. Olivia turned and smiled warmly as he approached. She reached out and rested her hand flat against his chest. He covered her small hand with his own rough fingers. "The southern merchants arrived this morning," Olivia said. "They brought the first massive shipment of raw iron." Silas nodded slowly. "Did they complain about the new tariffs?" he asked. "They paid exactly what I demanded," she replied confidently. "They know better than to test my patience after what happened to Kaelin." Silas let out a low, deep laugh. He leaned down and kissed the top of her dark hair. "You are a terrifying woman, Olivia." "I have an entire kingdom to run," she answered simply. "Someone has to rebuild the bridges you burned." "I burned them to keep you warm," Silas countered softly. She looked up into his dark eyes and saw the absolute truth in his words. Elian ran around the corner of the stone wall. The boy was holding a thick leather-bound book tightly against his chest. He had grown an inch since the winter storms passed. His face was no longer hollow or covered in purple bruises. He wore fine wool tunics dyed in the royal crimson colors. The boy stopped running when he saw them. He set the heavy book down on a smooth stone bench. He raised his hands and began to sign with rapid, fluid motions. Silas and Olivia had brought a master scholar from the coastal cities to teach him. The old man specialized in educating the deaf nobility of the Western Islands. They all learned the silent language together by the hearth every evening. I finished the long history lesson. Elian signed carefully. Silas stepped forward and looked down at the heavy book. "Did you understand the Western campaigns?" Silas signed back. Elian nodded enthusiastically. "The Western lords were foolish to fight you," the boy signed. Silas and Olivia shared a quick, highly amused glance. "They were very foolish," Silas agreed. Elian picked up the heavy book again. He patted the gray warhound roughly on the head. The massive dog leaned into the boy's leg and closed its yellow eyes. "I am hungry," Elian signed. Silas checked the position of the sun. It was resting low against the jagged western peaks. "It is time for dinner," Silas announced. The three of them walked back into the castle together. The stone halls felt entirely different now. Servants did not press themselves against the walls in blind panic. They did not drop their eyes to the floor when the king passed. Guards nodded respectfully rather than trembling in their armor. The oppressive, suffocating dread that ruled the keep for 10 years was dead. Silas had stopped hanging men for minor offenses. He had stopped burning entire villages out of blind, unplaced rage. He had a son watching his every single move. He had a wife grounding his darkest, most violent impulses. He was finally learning how to be a ruler rather than a warlord.
He realized that building a country was much harder than destroying one. But he welcomed the difficult work with an open heart. He wanted to leave Elian a prosperous kingdom, not a graveyard. They entered the cavernous great hall as the evening bells chimed. The vast room was brightly lit and filled with lively conversation. Dozens of lords and ladies sat at the long wooden tables. They drank spiced wine and shared stories of the spring thaw. The crushing tension that once suffocated the royal meals was entirely gone. Silas led his family up the stone steps to the raised dais. The high table was set with heavy silver plates and golden goblets. Silas pulled out Olivia's heavy chair first. She sat down smoothly and smoothed her dark velvet skirts. Silas walked to his own massive wooden chair in the exact center. He paused and looked down at the space to his right. For 10 excruciating years, a golden plate had sat perfectly clean on that wood. For 10 years, steam had risen from untouched meat while his heart slowly rotted. He had stared at that empty space and prayed for the world to end. That specific golden plate was no longer empty. Elian climbed eagerly into the chair right beside Silas. The boy pulled the golden plate closer to the edge of the table. A young servant stepped forward, carrying a heavy silver platter. The servant did not look afraid or hesitant. He smiled warmly down at the eager boy. He served a massive portion of roasted chicken and spring vegetables onto the gold plate. Elian picked up his heavy silver fork immediately. He ate with the healthy, ravenous appetite of a growing child. Silas sat down slowly in his own chair. He poured a cup of dark red wine. He looked out over the crowded, noisy hall. He remembered the terrifying silence that used to choke this specific room. He remembered gripping his dagger and wishing for death. He turned his head to the left. Olivia was quietly speaking with Lord Thorne about the new grain silos. She looked incredibly beautiful and powerful in the warm candlelight. Her hazel eyes caught his intense stare. She stopped talking to the old advisor immediately. She offered Silas a soft, entirely private smile. Silas reached under the heavy wooden table. He found her small hand and held it tightly. He turned his head to the right. Elian was secretly sneaking a piece of roasted chicken down to the warhound. The massive dog swallowed the meat silently under the table. Silas reached out and rested his large hand on the back of Elian's neck. The boy did not flinch or pull away. He simply leaned back comfortably into the king's strong grip. Elian continued to eat his warm dinner. Silas picked up his own fork. He took a slow, incredibly deep breath. His broad chest expanded freely without hitting an invisible wall of pain. The phantom wounds of his past were finally, permanently closed. He had fought his entire life to conquer the brutal world around him. He had built a massive empire of blood and broken iron. But sitting here at this busy table, he finally understood the truth. His massive empire meant absolutely nothing compared to the 2 people sitting beside him. The food on his plate was finally hot. The fire in the stone hearth was warm. The Queen of the North was safely home. The young heir to the throne was secure. Silas took a large bite of the fresh bread. It tasted incredibly sweet. It tasted like a future he actually wanted to live long enough to see. The long, bitter 10-year winter was permanently over. The Alpha King never needed to set an extra plate ever again.
Silas showed us that true strength isn't about winning wars. It's keeping a seat open for the one you love, no matter how much time has passed. How did their reunion make you feel? Let me know in the comments, and tell me where in the world you're listening from today. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories. See you next time.